The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke through the narrow streets of Dillon, Montana. And Marcus Greyson had been watching the woman with auburn hair for the better part of an hour without meaning to. He had come down from his cabin in the mountains for supplies, a trip he made only when absolutely necessary. And now he stood outside the general store with 100 pounds of flour slung over one massive shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. His dark hair hung past his collar, and his beard was trimmed close enough to see the strong line of his jaw. Years of chopping wood, hauling game, and surviving harsh winters had carved his body into something formidable. All broad shoulders and corded muscle beneath his worn leather vest and flannel shirt. He was 30 years old and had spent the last 8 of them alone in those mountains, and that was exactly how he preferred it. The woman sat on the wooden steps of the church across the dusty street, her dress faded but clean, her hands folded in her lap. She could not have been more than 25, with delicate features and eyes the color of honey in sunlight. Marcus had noticed her because she had been sitting there since before noon, and it was now well past 2 in the afternoon. She had not moved except to smooth her skirts or adjust the small cloth bundle beside her. Something about her stillness caught his attention in a way that made him uncomfortable. He was not a man who paid attention to women. He was not a man who paid attention to anyone. He was about to turn away and head back up the mountain when he saw the stranger approach her. The man was rail thin and dirty, his clothes hanging off his frame like he had not eaten a proper meal in weeks. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. Marcus had seen plenty of men like that in Dillon. The silver boom had gone bust 3 years back, and the town was full of miners who had lost everything. This man looked like he had been walking for days, maybe weeks. He stopped a few feet from the woman and said something Marcus could not hear from this distance. The woman looked up at the stranger, and even from across the street, Marcus could see the compassion that softened her features. She reached for the cloth bundle beside her and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a single piece of bread, maybe half a loaf, crusty and golden. It was clearly all she had. Marcus watched as she tore the bread in half, offering the larger piece to the stranger without hesitation. The man took it with trembling hands, and tears began streaming down his weathered face. The woman smiled at him, a gentle, radiant smile that seemed to light up the whole street, and she began eating her own smaller portion slowly, as if savoring every bite. Something shifted in Marcus's chest, something he had not felt in 8 years. It was like a door he had nailed shut was suddenly being pried open, and light was flooding in whether he wanted it or not. He stood there, frozen, the flour still balanced on his shoulder, watching this woman share her last meal with a complete stranger. Most people in Dillon would have walked right past that man. Most would have clutched their food closer and hurried away. But this woman, whoever she was, had given away what was probably the only thing standing between her and hunger. She had the biggest heart he had ever seen. Marcus set the flour down on the porch of the general store and walked across the street before he could talk himself out of it. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. The stranger had already wandered off, clutching his bread like it was made of gold, and the woman was finishing the last bites of her portion. She looked up as Marcus's shadow fell across her, and her eyes widened slightly. He knew what he looked like. He was big and rough and probably frightening to a woman sitting alone. "Excuse me, miss," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. "I saw what you did just now." Her cheeks flushed pink and she stood up quickly, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "I do not know what you mean, sir." "The bread," Marcus said. He gestured vaguely in the direction the stranger had gone. "You gave half of it away, looked like it was all you had." "Oh," her flush deepened. That was nothing. He needed it more than I did. Did you? Marcus asked. Have anything else, I mean. She met his eyes for a long moment, and he saw the truth there even before she spoke. No, she admitted quietly, but I will manage. I always do. Marcus felt that strange pulling sensation in his chest again. He had not cared about another human being in 8 years, not since his wife died giving birth to their stillborn son. He had buried them both on a cold February morning and walked away from everything he knew. He had built a cabin high in the mountains where no one could find him, where he could trap and hunt and exist without the pain of caring. And now, this woman with her honey-colored eyes and generous spirit was making him feel things he thought had died along with his family. "Come with me," he said abruptly. She blinked. "I beg your pardon," to the hotel, the restaurant there. "Let me buy you a proper meal." "Sir, I could not possibly—" "Marcus," he interrupted. "My name is Marcus Greyson, and you can, because I am asking you to, please." She hesitated, and he could see her weighing the propriety of accepting against the very real hunger she must have been feeling. Finally, she nodded. "My name is Margaret Porter, and I would be very grateful, Mr. Greyson." "Marcus," he said again. "Marcus," she repeated, and the sound of his name on her lips did something dangerous to his carefully constructed walls. They walked side by side to the Dillon Hotel, which was the only establishment in town that served hot meals. Marcus was acutely aware of the curious glances they attracted. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he kept to himself. Now here he was, walking down Main Street with a beautiful woman at his side. He could practically hear the gossip starting already. The hotel restaurant was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of roasted meat hanging in the air. Marcus guided Margaret to a table by the window and signaled to the waitress. "Bring us 2 of whatever the special is today," he said, "and coffee, and whatever pie you have." Margaret's eyes widened. "Marcus, that is too much. When was the last time you ate a full meal?" he asked bluntly. She looked down at her hands. "2 days ago." Something hot and protective flared in his gut. "Then it is not too much." The waitress brought coffee first, steaming and black, and Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup like she was drawing warmth from it. Marcus studied her across the table. Up close, he could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the way her dress hung a little loose on her frame. She was beautiful, but she was also struggling, and that fact made him angry in a way he did not fully understand. "Why were you sitting on those church steps?" he asked. Margaret took a sip of coffee before answering. "I was waiting for the Reverend. I had hoped he might know of work in town." "I have been looking for 2 weeks now." "What kind of work?" "Anything," she said simply. "Cleaning, cooking, mending. I can read and write, so perhaps teaching, though I know the school already has a teacher. I am not particular, I just need something." "Where are you staying?" "There is a boarding house on the edge of town. Mrs. Chen runs it. She has been kind enough to let me stay even though I am behind on my rent." Marcus frowned. "What brought you to Dillon?" Margaret's expression closed off slightly, and he saw pain flicker across her features. "My father died 3 months ago. He was a prospector, always chasing the next big strike. We had been living in Virginia City, but after he passed, I could not afford to stay. He had debts, you see. I sold everything we had to pay them off, and I thought I might find work here." I had heard Dillon was growing. "It was," Marcus said. 3 years ago. Now it is dying, just like most of these mining towns." The waitress arrived with their food, and for a few minutes they ate in silence. Marcus watched as Margaret took small, careful bites, as if trying to make the meal last. She had the manners of someone who had been raised properly, and he found himself wondering about her life before her father died. She did not seem like the kind of woman who belonged in a rough mining town. "What about you?" Margaret asked, setting down her fork. You said your name is Marcus Greyson. Are you a miner? No, Marcus said. I am a trapper. I live up in the mountains. I come to town maybe 4 times a year for supplies. That sounds lonely, he shrugged. I prefer it that way. Why? The question was asked gently, but it still felt like a knife between his ribs. Marcus took a long drink of coffee, debating how much to tell her. I had a wife once, he finally said, and we were going to have a baby, but they both died, and I decided I did not want to be around people anymore. Margaret's eyes filled with sympathy, and she reached across the table to touch his hand. I am so sorry, Marcus. That must have been unbearably painful. Her hand was small and warm on his, and Marcus felt that door in his chest crack open a little wider. He should have pulled away. He should have changed the subject. Instead, he turned his hand over and squeezed her fingers gently. It was a long time ago. 8 years, Margaret said softly, and he looked at her in surprise. She smiled sadly. You said you have been living alone in the mountains for 8 years. That means that is when it happened. You are observant. I am a good listener, she corrected. And I think sometimes people need to be heard, even when they convince themselves they do not. They finished their meal, and Marcus ordered a second helping for Margaret, which she protested but eventually accepted. By the time they stepped back out onto the street, the sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Marcus knew he should head back up to his cabin. He had supplies to pack and a long hike ahead of him. But the thought of leaving Margaret here, hungry and alone in a dying town, sat wrong in his stomach. I want to help you, he said abruptly. Margaret turned to face him, her expression wary. You have already helped me more than I can repay. I mean with work, with finding something stable. Why? The question was not accusatory, just curious. You do not know me. Because you gave away your last piece of bread to a stranger, Marcus said. Because you have a good heart, and those are rare. And because I have money saved up that I do not use for anything. Let me help. Margaret studied him for a long moment, and he could see her fighting some internal battle. Pride, probably. She struck him as the kind of woman who was used to taking care of herself. What do you have in mind? She finally asked. Give me a day, Marcus said. Let me ask around town, see what I can find. In the meantime, I will settle your account at the boarding house so you do not have to worry about that. Marcus, I cannot let you. You can, he said firmly. And you will. Please, Margaret, let me do this. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. Why are you being so kind to me? Because you made me feel something I thought was dead. Because watching you share that bread reminded me that there is still goodness in the world. Because I think I am half in love with you already, and that terrifies me. Because you need help, he said instead. And I can give it. Margaret nodded slowly. All right, but I will pay you back. Somehow, someday, I will pay you back. We can worry about that later. Marcus walked Margaret back to the boarding house, which turned out to be a tidy building with a neat garden out front. Mrs. Chen, a sturdy woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression, answered the door. Her face softened when she saw Margaret, then turned curious when she noticed Marcus looming behind her. Mrs. Chen, Margaret said, this is Marcus Greyson. He has kindly offered to settle my account. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. Has he now? Marcus pulled out his wallet and counted out enough bills to cover what he suspected was several weeks of back rent, plus a month in advance. This should take care of it, he said, handing the money to Mrs. Chen. The older woman took the bills and counted them, then looked at Marcus with an expression that was equal parts approval and warning. You treating this girl right, Mr. Greyson? Yes, madam, see that you do. Margaret is a good girl. She deserves respect. Yes, madam, Marcus repeated, Mrs. Chen nodded and turned to Margaret. You go on and get some rest, dear. You look exhausted. Margaret glanced at Marcus and he saw gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. I will be back tomorrow, he promised. Wait for me, I will wait. Marcus walked back through town as darkness fell, his mind churning. He collected his flour from the general store and arranged for the rest of his supplies to be held until the next day, then rented a room at the hotel. It was the first time in 8 years that he had slept anywhere but his cabin, and he lay awake on the lumpy mattress, staring at the ceiling. He kept seeing Margaret's face, the way she had smiled at that starving stranger, the way her eyes had lit up when she laughed at something he said over dinner. He had meant what he told her. He wanted to help. But there was more to it than that, and he was not quite ready to examine what that more might be. The next morning, Marcus set out to make good on his promise. He started at the Mercantile, where the owner's wife mentioned that their daughter, who lived on a ranch 10 miles outside town, was expecting her third baby and could use help around the house. He visited the schoolhouse, where the teacher, an elderly man with rheumatism, admitted he could use an assistant for the younger children. He stopped by the doctor's office, the hotel, the saloon, asking if anyone needed help with anything. By noon, he had a list of possibilities. He found Margaret sitting on the porch of the boarding house, mending a hole in one of her stockings. She looked up when she heard his footsteps and set aside her sewing, a smile breaking across her face. That smile did dangerous things to his heart. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." Marcus sat down beside her on the step, the wood creaking under his weight. "I have some leads on work for you." He told her about the rancher's daughter, the school teacher, and a few other possibilities he had uncovered. Margaret listened intently, her expression growing more hopeful with each option. "Marcus, I do not know what to say. This is more than I could have hoped for." "The rancher's daughter sounds like the best option," Marcus said. "Room and board included plus wages. It would get you out of town and into a more stable situation." Margaret nodded slowly. "It does sound perfect, although I confess I will miss Dylan. I have been here long enough that it is starting to feel familiar." "You would miss Dylan?" Marcus asked, surprised. "It is a dying town full of desperate people. It is also a town where a stranger bought me dinner and helped me find work when he did not have to," Margaret said, meeting his eyes. "That counts for something." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Marcus found himself studying the curve of her cheek, the way the sunlight caught the red in her hair. He wanted to reach out and touch her, to see if she was as soft as she looked. Instead, he cleared his throat and stood up. "I will take you out to the ranch tomorrow if you would like. Introduce you to the family." "I would like that very much." That evening, Marcus took Margaret to dinner again, this time at a small cafe run by a widow who made the best stew in Montana. They talked easily, the conversation flowing from one topic to another. Margaret told him about growing up in San Francisco, where her mother had died when she was young, and how her father had moved them all over the West chasing gold and silver. Marcus found himself talking about his childhood in Missouri, about learning to trap from his father, about the war that had taken his older brother. He talked about his wife, Rebecca, and how they had met at a church social. He even talked about the day she died, which he had never spoken about to anyone. "I buried them on the hill behind the cabin," he said, staring down at his coffee. "I visit them sometimes, but it does not hurt the way it used to. Mostly I just feel empty." "Grief is strange that way," Margaret said. "When my father died, I thought I would drown in it. But then one day I woke up and realized I had gone a whole hour without thinking about him. And I felt guilty, like I was betraying his memory. But I think that is just how we heal. Little by little until the pain becomes bearable, You are wise for someone so young, Margaret laughed. I am not that young. I am 24, and I have seen enough hardship to last a lifetime. 24 is young when you are 30. 6 years is not such a great difference. No, Marcus agreed. I suppose it is not. They walked back to the boarding house slowly, neither of them in a hurry to say good night. The streets were quiet, most of the town already asleep. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and piano music drifted from the saloon. When they reached the boarding house, Margaret turned to face him, and in the moonlight she looked almost ethereal. Thank you again, Marcus, for everything. You have already thanked me, I know, but I do not think I can say it enough. Marcus reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. You do not need to thank me at all, Margaret. I am glad I can help. She leaned into his touch, just slightly, and he felt his breath catch. It would be so easy to lean down and kiss her. So easy to pull her into his arms and feel her warmth against him. But he held back, because he was not sure if he had the right, and because he was terrified of what it might mean if he did. Good night, Margaret. Good night, Marcus. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for the ride out to the ranch. Marcus rented a wagon and 2 horses from the livery, and Margaret met him in front of the boarding house with a small bag containing all her possessions. It was heartbreaking how little she had. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hands spanning her waist easily, and tried not to notice how perfectly she fit against him for that brief moment. The ride to the ranch took about 2 hours, following a rutted road that wound through hills covered in golden grass. They talked and laughed, and Marcus felt something in his chest loosening, like a knot that had been tied tight for 8 years was finally coming undone. Margaret asked him about life in the mountains, and he found himself describing his cabin in detail. The little things he had built to make it comfortable, the way the sunrise looked over the peaks, the wildlife that visited his clearing. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was really paying attention. It sounds beautiful, she said. Lonely but beautiful. It is both, Marcus admitted. The ranch belonged to the Galloway family, and they turned out to be warm and welcoming. Mrs. Galloway was a pretty blonde woman in her late 20s, heavily pregnant and clearly exhausted. Her 2 young sons were wild as March hares, running in circles around the yard while their father tried unsuccessfully to corral them. When Marcus explained why they had come, Mrs. Galloway's face lit up with relief. "Oh, thank the Lord," she said. "I have been praying for help. These boys are going to be the death of me, and with the baby coming in a month, I am at my wits' end." Margaret stepped forward with that gentle smile Marcus was coming to love. "I would be honored to help you, Mrs. Galloway. I am very good with children." They settled the details quickly. Margaret would have her own small room in the house, 3 meals a day and a fair wage. She would help with the children, the cooking, and light housework. It was exactly the kind of stable situation she needed, and Marcus should have been happy. Instead, he felt a sinking sensation in his gut as he realized that Margaret would be 10 miles outside of town, and he would be even farther up in the mountains. The chances of seeing her again were slim. As if reading his thoughts, Margaret pulled him aside before he left. "Will you come visit?" she asked. "I know you prefer your solitude, but I would like to see you again." "I would like that too," Marcus said, and meant it more than he had meant anything in a long time. "Then promise me you will come back. In a few weeks, maybe. I promise." He climbed back onto the wagon and drove away, glancing back only once to see Margaret standing in the yard, waving. The image stayed with him all the way back to Dillon, and then all the way up the mountain to his cabin. He spent the next 3 weeks trying to focus on his work, setting traps and checking lines and preparing for the winter that was coming. But his thoughts kept drifting to Margaret. He wondered how she was settling in at the ranch, if she was happy, if she thought about him the way he thought about her. It was late October when he finally made the trip back down the mountain. He told himself he needed more supplies, but the truth was he needed to see her. He needed to know if what he felt was real or just the product of 8 years of loneliness. He rode straight to the Galloway ranch, his heart pounding harder than it should have been. Margaret was in the yard hanging laundry when he arrived, and the sight of her stopped him in his tracks. She looked healthy, her cheeks pink with color, her hair shining in the sunlight. When she saw him, her whole face transformed with joy, and she dropped the sheet she was holding and ran toward him. Marcus barely had time to dismount before she threw her arms around his neck. "You came back," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. Marcus wrapped his arms around her and held on tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the way she fit against him like she was made to be there. "I promised I would. I was afraid you might have changed your mind." "Not a chance." They spent the afternoon together, walking around the ranch while Margaret showed him everything she had been doing. The Galloways had given her free rein to make improvements, and she had been busy. The garden was better organized, the chicken coop had been repaired, and the house positively gleamed. Mrs. Galloway, who was now too pregnant to do much more than sit and rest, sang Margaret's praises. "She is a godsend," Mrs. Galloway told Marcus. "I do not know what we would have done without her." That evening, Margaret and Marcus sat on the porch steps watching the sun set over the mountains. They sat close enough that their shoulders touched, and Marcus could feel the warmth of her through his shirt. He wanted to tell her how much he had missed her, how empty his cabin had felt without the memory of her in it, how he thought about her every single day. But the words stuck in his throat. "I missed you," Margaret said softly, saving him the trouble. "I missed you too." She turned to look at him, her honey-colored eyes searching his face. "Marcus, can I ask you something? Anything? What is this between us? This thing I feel when I am with you." His heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "I do not know, but I feel it too." "It scares me a little," she admitted. "I have never felt this way about anyone before." "It scares me too," Marcus said. "I did not think I would ever want to feel anything for anyone again, but then I saw you sharing that bread and something changed." Margaret reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his bearded jaw. "I think I am falling in love with you, Marcus Greyson, and I do not know what to do about it." Marcus turned his head and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I think I am falling in love with you too, Margaret Porter. And I think we should just let it happen. What if it ends badly? What if I lose you the way you lost Rebecca?" "We could die tomorrow," Marcus said. "A horse could bolt, a storm could come up, 1,000 different things could go wrong, but we could also live for 50 more years. We do not get guarantees, Margaret, we just get choices, and I choose this. I choose you if you will have me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, I will have you." Marcus leaned down and kissed her finally, and it was like coming home. Her lips were soft and warm, and she tasted like the apple pie they had eaten with dinner. He cupped her face in his hands, trying to be gentle even though he wanted to pull her closer and never let go. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "That was worth waiting for," Margaret said, sounding dazed. "It was," Marcus agreed. They courted properly after that, or as properly as they could given the circumstances. Marcus made the trip down from his cabin every week, spending a day at the ranch before heading back up into the mountains. They went on long walks, had picnics by the creek, and talked about everything under the sun. Mrs. Galloway chaperoned when appropriate, but she also gave them privacy when she could, clearly delighted by the romance unfolding in her home. In November, Mrs. Galloway had her baby, a healthy girl they named Rose. Margaret was there for the birth, holding Mrs. Galloway's hand and helping the midwife. Marcus arrived the next day to find Margaret cradling the newborn, her face soft with wonder. The sight of her holding that baby did something to him, made him imagine a future he had thought was lost forever. "She is beautiful," Margaret whispered, not looking up from the tiny face. Marcus knelt beside her chair. "You would make a wonderful mother." Margaret met his eyes, and he saw hope and longing there. "Do you think so?" "I know so." By December, the snow was falling heavily in the mountains, and Marcus knew it would soon be too dangerous to make the trip to the ranch. The thought of not seeing Margaret for months was unbearable. So one snowy afternoon, he rode down to the ranch and asked to speak with her privately. They went to the barn, where it was warmer, and Marcus pulled a small wooden box from his pocket. He had carved it himself during the long evenings in his cabin, working by firelight to get every detail right. "I made this for you," he said, handing it to her. Margaret opened the box, and her breath caught. Inside was a ring, simple and silver, with a small piece of polished turquoise set in the center. "Marcus, it is not much," he said quickly. "But I wanted you to have something that meant something. Margaret, I love you. I have loved you since the moment I saw you share that bread. You have the biggest heart of anyone I have ever met, and you make me want to be a better man. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face, but she was smiling. "Yes. Oh, Marcus, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he kissed her, pouring everything he felt into that kiss. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for a long moment they just held each other. "I do not want to wait," Margaret said when they finally pulled apart. "I do not want a big wedding or a long engagement. I just want to be your wife. Are you sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything." They were married a week later in the church in Dillon, with the Galloways and Mrs. Chen as witnesses. The reverend who performed the ceremony was the same one Margaret had been waiting for that day on the church steps, and he beamed at them throughout the service. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her alter, and Marcus wore his best shirt and vest. When the reverend pronounced them man and wife, Marcus kissed his bride with a reverence that made Mrs. Galloway cry. After the ceremony, they had a small celebration at the hotel, and then Marcus took his wife home. The ride up to the cabin took most of the day, with Marcus leading a pack horse loaded with Margaret's belongings and supplies they would need for the winter. The snow was falling steadily, covering the world in white, and Margaret sat behind him on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. "Tell me about the cabin again," she said. "I want to picture it." "It is small," Marcus said. "Just one room, really, with a sleeping loft. But it is solid and warm. There is a fireplace that takes up most of one wall, and I built the furniture myself. The windows face east, so you get the sunrise, and there is a little porch where you can sit and watch the deer come through the clearing." It sounds perfect. It was full dark by the time they reached the cabin, and Marcus lit a lantern so Margaret could see. He watched nervously as she stepped inside, looking around at his simple home. He had cleaned everything before he left, but now he saw it through her eyes and worried it was not enough. The cabin was rustic, with rough wooden walls and a packed dirt floor covered in deerskin rugs. But the fireplace was clean, the bed was sturdy, and he had carved decorative touches into the furniture over the years. "Oh, Marcus," Margaret breathed. "It is wonderful." Relief flooded through him. "You really think so?" "I really do." She turned to face him, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "It is cozy and warm and perfect, just like I imagined." Marcus built up the fire while Margaret explored the cabin, exclaiming over the little details she discovered. He had hidden a vase on the mantel and filled it with dried wildflowers. There were extra blankets folded on a chair and a new dress hanging on a peg which he had purchased in town and hoped would fit. Margaret found it and pressed the fabric to her chest, tears in her eyes. "You thought of everything. I wanted you to feel welcome. This is your home now, too." They ate a simple supper of bread and cheese, and then Marcus showed Margaret the sleeping loft. He had built it years ago, a platform accessible by a ladder, tucked under the sloped roof. There was a thick mattress stuffed with goose down, piled high with quilts and furs. It was the most comfortable bed Marcus could provide, and he hoped it would be enough. "It is our wedding night," Margaret said softly, her cheeks flushing pink. Marcus took her hands, his own heart racing. "We do not have to do anything you are not ready for. I can wait as long as you need." Margaret looked up at him, love shining in her eyes. "I do not want to wait. I want to be your wife in every way." He kissed her then, slow and tender, taking his time. They undressed each other carefully in the lamplight, exploring and discovering with gentle hands. Marcus tried to be patient, to be careful with her, but Margaret was not fragile. She was strong and sure, matching his passion with her own. When they finally came together, it felt like two halves of a whole joining, and Marcus knew he had been incomplete all these years without her. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, the fire crackling below, the snow falling softly outside. Margaret traced patterns on Marcus's chest, and he played with her hair, neither of them wanting to sleep and break the spell of this perfect night. "I love you," Margaret whispered. "I love you too, more than I thought I could love anyone." "Do you think Rebecca would approve?" The question surprised him, but Marcus considered it seriously. "I think she would. She was a good person. She would want me to be happy. I hope I can make you happy." Marcus rolled over so he could look into her eyes. "You already have, Margaret. You have given me a reason to live again. I did not realize how much I needed that until I met you." That first winter was the happiest time of Marcus's life. He taught Margaret how to trap and hunt, how to read the weather and navigate by the stars. She was a quick learner, fearless in a way that both impressed and terrified him. She could shoot almost as well as he could by February, and she had no qualms about skinning the game they caught. In turn, she taught him things he had forgotten, like how to laugh freely, how to find joy in small moments, how to hope for the future. They were snowed in for most of January, the drifts piling up so high that they could barely open the door. But inside the cabin, they were warm and safe and utterly content. They cooked together, read aloud from the few books Marcus owned, played cards by firelight, and made love with a frequency and passion that never seemed to diminish. Marcus had never been happier. In March, when the snows finally began to melt, they made the trip down to Dillon for supplies. Margaret insisted on visiting the Galloways, and they were thrilled to see her. Baby Rose had grown, and Mrs. Galloway was pregnant again, which she announced with a mixture of joy and exasperation. Margaret held Rose and cooed over her, and Marcus felt that familiar pull in his chest, the one that said he wanted this with Margaret. He wanted children and a future and all the things he had given up on. That night back in the cabin, Marcus brought it up. "Would you want children?" He asked carefully. "I know we have not talked about it, but seeing you with Rose today." Margaret's face lit up. "I would love children. I was hoping you would want them too. I do, more than anything." "Then let us have them," Margaret said simply. "Let us have a whole house full of children and fill this cabin with noise and laughter." By summer, Margaret was pregnant. She told him one morning in July, her face glowing with happiness and nerves. Marcus picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. They spent the next months preparing, with Marcus building a proper crib and Margaret sewing tiny clothes. She was healthy and strong through the pregnancy, rarely sick, and she insisted on keeping up with her chores right until the end. Their son was born in March of 1877, during a late spring snowstorm. The midwife from Dillon had come up to stay with them for the last few weeks, and she guided Marcus through the birth when it happened faster than expected. Marcus held Margaret's hand and whispered encouragement, his heart in his throat, terrified he would lose her the way he had lost Rebecca. But Margaret was strong, and their son came into the world screaming and healthy, with a shock of dark hair in his mother's eyes. They named him Michael, after Marcus's brother who had died in the war. Marcus held his son for the first time and felt something click into place, a sense of completion he had not known he was missing. This was what life was supposed to be, not isolation and grief, but love and family and hope. The years that followed were full and happy. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Emma in 1879, and another son they named Thomas in 1881. The cabin got crowded, so Marcus built an addition, expanding it into a proper house with separate bedrooms and a real kitchen. Margaret planted a garden and kept chickens, and Marcus expanded his trapping to bring in more money. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. The children grew up wild and free, learning to read tracks and identify plants, helping with the traps in the garden, exploring the mountains they called home. Marcus taught them everything he knew, and Margaret taught them kindness and compassion, the same qualities that had first drawn him to her. Michael grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books. Emma was fearless and adventurous, always climbing trees and catching frogs. Thomas was the youngest and the sweetest, with a gentle heart that reminded Marcus of his mother. They went to town 3 or 4 times a year, and Margaret always insisted on visiting the Galloways and Mrs. Chen. The friendships she had formed in those early days remained strong, and the children loved playing with the Galloway kids. Marcus, who had once preferred solitude, found he did not mind the social calls as much as he thought he would. It helped that Margaret was always at his side, her hand in his, her presence a comfort. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Marcus took Margaret back to Dillon for a proper celebration. They left the children with Mrs. Chen, who spoiled them outrageously and spent 2 days just being a couple again. They had dinner at the hotel, danced to music from the saloon, and stayed in the same room where Marcus had slept that first night, when he was trying to figure out how to help the woman with the biggest heart he had ever seen. "You ever regret it?" Margaret asked as they lay in bed, her head on his chest. "Giving up your solitude for me?" "Not for a single second," Marcus said honestly. "You saved me, Margaret. I was just existing before I met you. You taught me how to live again." "You saved me too," Margaret said softly. "I was alone and scared, and you gave me hope. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything." As the years went on, Marcus and Margaret grew older together, their love deepening with time. They added more rooms to the house as the children grew, and eventually they started talking about what would happen when the children left to make their own lives. Michael, who was the first to leave, went to college in Butte to study law. Emma married a rancher and settled on the other side of the mountains. Thomas stayed close, building his own cabin just a few miles away, and taking over most of the trapping business as Marcus's joints began to ache with age. But even as the children grew and left, Marcus and Margaret remained the center of each other's worlds. They took walks in the mountains, hand in hand, moving slower than they used to but no less in love. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set, remembering the early days of their courtship. Margaret still had the ring Marcus had carved for her, though it was worn smooth from years of wear. And Marcus still remembered with perfect clarity the moment he first saw her share her last bread with a stranger. "You remember that day?" he asked one evening when they were both in their 60s, their hair gray and their faces lined with age. "The day I first saw you." "Of course," Margaret said. "I was sitting on the church steps waiting for the reverend, and you were this giant, intimidating mountain man who turned out to have the kindest heart." "I was not kind. I was selfish. I saw you do something beautiful and I wanted to be part of that beauty." "You were kind," Margaret insisted. "You bought me dinner. You found me work. You changed my life. You changed mine first." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as their grandchildren played in the yard. Michael had come to visit with his wife and 2 daughters. Emma had brought her husband and their 4 sons. Thomas and his wife, who lived close enough to visit often, had 3 children who were climbing trees like their mother had at their age. The house that had once been a solitary cabin was now filled with noise and life and love. "We did good, did we not?" Margaret said, her eyes on the children. "We did great," Marcus corrected. He pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I love you, Margaret Greyson. I have loved you for over 40 years, and I will love you for however many years we have left." "And I love you, Marcus Greyson. You are my heart. You always have been." They stayed on the mountain as long as they could, but eventually Marcus's health began to fail. His heart was weak, the doctor said, worn out from years of hard living. He lasted long enough to see his 70th birthday, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, with Margaret at his side. He died peacefully in his sleep on a cold February night, and Margaret held his hand the whole time, whispering that she loved him, that she would see him again someday. Marcus was buried on the hill behind the house, next to the graves of Rebecca and the baby he had lost so long ago. At the funeral, Margaret stood strong and dry-eyed, her children supporting her on either side. But later, when everyone had left, she went back up to the hill and sat beside his grave. "Thank you," she said softly, her hand resting on the fresh earth. "Thank you for seeing me that day. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for giving me a life I never dreamed I could have." She lived for 5 more years after Marcus died, staying in the house they had built together, cared for by Thomas and his family. She taught her grandchildren to bake bread and told them stories about their grandfather, about how he had been strong and kind and brave. She told them about the day they met, about how she had shared her last bread with a stranger, and how Marcus had seen something in that simple act that changed both their lives. When Margaret died at the age of 73, she was buried beside Marcus on the hill. The whole family came for the funeral, 3 generations of Greysons who existed because a mountain man had seen a woman with the biggest heart, and he had been wise enough to love her. Michael gave the eulogy, speaking of his parents' great love story, of the legacy they had left behind. "My father once told me," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, "that he had given up on life until he met my mother. He said she taught him to hope again, to love again, to believe in goodness. And my mother used to say that my father gave her a home when she had nothing. But the truth is, they gave each other everything. They gave each other a life worth living, and they gave us all an example of what real love looks like." The house on the mountain passed to Thomas, who raised his own children there and eventually his grandchildren. The story of Marcus and Margaret became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and holidays. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting over the mountains, people swore they could see 2 figures walking hand in hand through the trees. A big man with broad shoulders and a woman with auburn hair, still together even in death, their love as enduring as the mountains themselves. In Dillon, where it had all begun, the old-timers still remembered the mountain man who had come down from his cabin and fallen in love with the woman on the church steps. They remembered how she had shared her last bread with a stranger, and how Marcus Greyson had seen in that simple act the biggest heart he had ever known. It was a story they told to their children and grandchildren, a reminder that kindness and compassion and love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the biggest hearts came in the most unassuming packages. And up on the mountain, in the house that Marcus built and Margaret made into a home, their family continued to grow and thrive. The children taught their children about trapping and hunting, about kindness and compassion, about the importance of seeing people for who they really are. They taught them that love was not just a feeling but a choice, one you made every single day. And they taught them that sometimes the most important moments in life were the smallest ones, like sharing bread with a stranger, or stopping to help someone in need, or being brave enough to open your heart after you thought it was broken forever. The legacy of Marcus and Margaret Greyson lived on in every generation, a testament to the power of love and kindness, and a reminder that even in the hardest times, in the roughest places, goodness could flourish if you were brave enough to let it. Their story was one of hope and redemption, of two lonely people who found each other and built a life that mattered. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth holding on to when the world seemed dark. And so it was told, year after year, generation after generation. The story of the mountain man who saw a woman sharing her last bread with a stranger, and who knew in that moment that she had the biggest heart he would ever find. It was a story of love that conquered loneliness, of compassion that changed lives, of two souls who found each other against all odds and held on tight. It was, in the end, a story about what it means to be truly human, to look beyond yourself and see the goodness in others, to take a chance on love even when you are afraid, to build something beautiful out of the broken pieces of your past. Marcus and Margaret Greyson lived their love story fully, completely, with no regrets and no looking back. They raised their children with love and taught them to be good people. They built a home that stood for over 100 years, a physical testament to the strength of their bond. And they left behind a legacy that went far beyond buildings and land, a legacy of love and kindness that rippled out through the generations, touching lives they would never meet, inspiring stories they would never hear. On the hill behind the house, their graves stood side by side, weathered by time but still standing strong. The inscriptions were simple. On Marcus's stone, "Beloved husband, father, grandfather, he loved deeply and lived well." On Margaret's, "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she had the biggest heart." And that, in the end, was the truth that mattered most. In a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, in a time when survival often meant looking out only for yourself, Margaret had chosen kindness. She had shared her last bread with a stranger. And Marcus had seen that act for what it truly was, a window into the kind of soul that could light up the world if you were brave enough to let it. Their story ended, as all stories do, but the love they shared never really died. It lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the lessons they taught and the examples they set. It lived on in the house on the mountain, where families still gathered to tell the story of how it all began. It lived on in Dillon, Montana, where the old church still stood, and where people still remembered the woman who sat on the steps with nothing but a piece of bread, and the mountain man who loved her for her generous heart. And perhaps, in the end, that is all any of us can hope for. To love deeply and be deeply loved in return. To leave the world a little better than we found it. To build something that lasts, whether it is a house or a family or simply a memory that makes people smile. Marcus and Margaret Greyson did all of that and more. Their love story was not fancy or complicated. It was simple and true and real. But sometimes, The simplest stories are the ones that matter most, the ones that remind us why we are here and what we are supposed to do with the time we are given. Love well. Love deeply. Love without reservation. See the goodness in people. Share what you have, even when you have nothing. Be kind, especially when it is hard. Those were the lessons of Marcus and Margaret's life together, and they were lessons worth learning. The sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors it had been that first night when Marcus walked Margaret back to the boarding house and knew his life was about to change. Somewhere in those mountains, the house still stood, full of family and laughter and love. Somewhere on a hill, two graves rested side by side, marking the final resting place of two people who had loved each other with everything they had. And somewhere, in the hearts of everyone who knew their story, Marcus and Margaret lived on, their love a beacon of hope in a sometimes dark world, proof that goodness and kindness and compassion could change everything, if you were brave enough to let them. The story of the mountain man and the woman with the biggest heart was complete. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the love at its center would never truly end, because real love never does. It simply transforms, rippling outward through time and space, touching lives and changing hearts, one person at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one shared piece of bread at a time. And that was how it should be. That was how it would always be. As long as there were people to remember, as long as there were stories to tell, Marcus and Margaret Greyson would live on, their love eternal, their legacy secure, their story a reminder that sometimes the biggest hearts can be found in the most unexpected places, and that true love is always, always worth the risk.